This is the House of Living Essence, and these conversations are an invitation to pause, to reflect, and perhaps to uncover something within yourself that has been quietly waiting beneath the noise. Wow, good day, good morning, good evening. As the title says, I'm going to talk about the magic of loneliness today. And you may think I'm crazy. How can loneliness be magic? Just stay with me till the end, and you will. This was one of the most profound lessons Fragrance taught me. One of the most profound. And it has made such a huge difference in my life, and it has really set me free. Of course, I experience loneliness still too, and it goes up and down. But oh, let me share the full picture with you and take you through it step by step, because this can change your life if you let it. I didn't actually start with loneliness when I thought of this podcast. It actually started with perfume. You know, I've been working with fragrance for a long time now, and when you work with these materials every day, you start noticing things. It's automatic. Well, I do anyway. But you put two things together and suddenly something happens that you didn't expect. Sometimes you have a beautiful oil and you think, well, surely if I add another beautiful oil, I'll have an even more beautiful fragrance. But you don't. Sometimes it becomes completely flat, or one swallows the other, or they just don't make sense together. And then sometimes you take two materials that are completely different from one another, and something extraordinary happens. One makes the other more beautiful. It lifts it, or it gives it depth, or suddenly you can smell something in the first material that you couldn't smell before. I find that so fascinating because the first material didn't change into something else. It actually became more recognizable because of the contrast. And somewhere, while I was working with this, I started thinking, I wonder if people are like this. You know, because we spend a massive, enormous amount of time of our lives trying to get rid of contrast. I mean, look at the world. We want people to agree with us. We want to fit in. We want to know what is acceptable. We compare ourselves all the time. We compete. Look at how we compete. We try to become more like the people who seem to be doing life correctly, and yet fragrance seems to work in almost the opposite way. Bergamot doesn't become vetiver. It doesn't need to. And rosemary doesn't need to become jasmine. Cedarwood doesn't sit there thinking, oh, goodness, I wish I was a rose. I know it sounds ridiculous when you say it like that, but we do it all the time. And the more I thought about that, the more I started wondering about something else. What if one of the reasons so many people are lonely is because we spend so much of our lives trying not to be ourselves? That was quite a thought for me. Because we usually think loneliness means to need more people, right? You feel lonely, therefore you need company. You need friends, you need a partner, you need somebody to phone you. And of course we need people. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that human beings don't need connection. We absolutely do. But then how do we explain the person who has a partner, friends, colleagues, children, family, people around them all the time, and still that person feels terribly lonely? That is the loneliness I became interested in. Maybe because that loneliness is not caused by the absence of people. Maybe it's caused by the absence of you. And then I started thinking about how that happens. Because nobody wakes up one morning and says, right, I'm going to construct a false personality today. It happens slowly. It probably starts when, or not probably, it definitely starts when we are very young children. We are taught what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And very often there isn't much discussion about it. You too sensitive. You too serious. You too analytical. I think I was accused once of being too consistently enthusiastic. What about you? Think too much. You talk too much. Or you're too loud, or you're too quiet, you're too emotional. Maybe you make a joke of everything. Maybe you're like, a clown. Or sometimes you ask too many questions. Perhaps that was me too. Whatever it is, you're too much of that or this. And when you're a child, you don't necessarily have the ability to say, hang on, let's discuss this. Why do you think I'm too sensitive? What exactly does too sensitive mean? You don't do that. You're told and you learn. This part of me gets approval. This part causes trouble. This part makes people uncomfortable. This part makes people laugh. Ooh, and this part gets me love. So I'll show more of this, and perhaps a little less of that, and we keep adjusting, tiny adjustments, until eventually we've created a version of ourselves that works quite well in the world. People like this version. People know this version. Maybe this version is very capable. Maybe she's always fine. Maybe he's always funny. Or maybe she never asks for anything. Maybe he never shows emotion. Or maybe, maybe like she agrees with everybody. Whatever the mask looks like, it works. Except for one problem. The real person is still underneath it all. And now something very interesting happens. You attract people who resonate with the person you are presenting. Of course you do. How could they possibly resonate with somebody you haven't even shown them yet? And I think that is where a very deep kind of loneliness can begin. Because you may actually be loved. That's the strange part. People may genuinely love you, but they're loving the person they've been allowed to meet. And somewhere underneath all that, you are thinking, nobody really knows me. And maybe they don't, but perhaps the more uncomfortable question is, have you allowed them to? And maybe an even more uncomfortable question, do you know the person underneath the mask anymore? Because if you've spent 30 or 40 or 50 years adjusting yourself according to everybody else's responses, it might actually take some time to work out what is you and what was learned. And this is where I came back to fragrance again, because a material has to be allowed to be itself. In fragrance, it has to. If I have a beautiful vetiver and I spend the entire formula trying to make the vetiver behave like bergamot, what am I doing? I've missed the vetiver. The whole point was the vetiver. Maybe it's earthy and maybe it's dark and, it's smoky. Maybe it's difficult. Fine. Then my job as a perfumer isn't necessarily to erase that character. My job is to understand it. What works with it? What lifts it? What gives it space? What makes the beautiful part of it more visible? And suddenly I thought, goodness, what if we did that with people? What if instead of immediately saying you too sensitive, we became curious about the sensitivity? What does this person notice that I don't? What if, instead of saying, you too analytical, we wondered what the analysis is trying to understand? What if, instead of saying, you too serious, we asked, what matters so deeply to this person? Even the clown, the person who makes a joke of everything, What's happening there? Why is humor the language there? I'm not saying every behavior is healthy, of course not. What I'm saying is, what if we become curious before we become corrective? Because so much of our personality may have been shaped by correction without that curiosity. And then later, when we finally try to express ourselves, the same thing can happen again. You say, this hurt me, and suddenly you're too sensitive. You say, I don't like that. And then you say, oh, you're difficult. You may say, I would prefer something else. And you get, you've changed. You try to explain what you're experiencing, and instead of discussing what happens, everybody starts discussing you. And if that happens often enough, you stop talking. You think, oh, leave it. It's not worth it, right? And then another thing happens and you leave that too, and another. And eventually you're not only hiding yourself from other people, you're actually hiding yourself from yourself. That, to me, is loneliness. Or at least one very important form of it. Yeah. Your authentic self is living quietly in the background of your own life. And everybody else is having a relationship with the mask. No wonder you feel lonely. And this is where I think we need to be careful with labels. The internet talks about narcissism constantly now. Constantly. It's everywhere. And everybody's a narcissist. And sometimes understanding a pattern can be enormously helpful, yes. But I don't want to diagnose people. I'm much more interested in what actually happens between people. Can I say how I feel without being ridiculed? Can I disagree with me and still allow my experience to exist? Can I? Can I say that hurt me and you say, I didn't intend that, but tell me what happened to you? That's completely different from saying, you're too sensitive. You don't have to agree with somebody's interpretation to be curious about it. And perhaps curiosity is one of the greatest gifts we can give another human being. Because curiosity, I'm getting tongue-tied. Curiosity says, I haven't decided who you are yet. Tell me. And you know what? Another fragrance lesson came into this for me. Contrast. Contrast is absolutely necessary. A fragrance would be terribly boring if everything in it smelled the same. Imagine. Sometimes the thing that makes one note extraordinary is the thing sitting right next to it. One elevates the other, and the elevated note cannot be elevated without the contrast. That made me think very differently about competition, because why are we competing? If a rosemary and you are, or let's say if I'm a rosemary, or a rosemary and a jasmine are sitting next to each other, and the rosemary wants to compete with the jasmine, what exactly are they competing about? I mean, if you were the rosemary and they were the jasmine, your jasmineness does not threaten my rosemaryness. In fact, under the right circumstances, perhaps you make something about me more visible. And I make something about you more visible. That's where gratitude starts making much more sense to me. Different people have different roles. Not everybody has to be your closest buddy person. Not everybody has to understand every part of you. One person may understand your humor. Somebody else understands your work. Someone may understand your history more. Someone else understands your creativity. And somebody you barely know may send you a message on exactly the day that you need it. That happened to me a few years ago, quite a while ago. I was feeling lonely, and I know all of this intellectually. I mean, I understand this. I've been studying this. I can understand it beautifully and still see lonely because I'm human, and still, feel lonely because I'm human. And then my phone beeped. Someone asked me how I was. Not somebody I speak to every day, just somebody who was there. And I suddenly realized I'm sitting here counting the people who are not here, and I'm not noticing the people who are. Even a person who is. That shocked me a little bit at the time because I thought, how dare I take anyone for granted? Why have I decided that this person counts and that person doesn't? Why have I decided what shape connection must have before I will recognize it as connection? Anyone can lead to someone. One conversation can lead to another, and one person can introduce another. Someone you hardly know can say something that stays with you for years. We don't know what role people are going to play in our lives, and perhaps that part of loneliness is that we become so focused on a particular missing note that we stop smelling the fragrance that is already there. I love that idea because, again, fragrance showed it to me. You can become obsessed with what a formula does have and completely miss everything that is already beautiful about it. And I think we do that with life. We count what is missing, and sometimes we forget to smell what is there. That doesn't mean we should settle for relationships that don't fulfill us. I mean, we shouldn't become blind to the relationships that do exist simply because they don't look the way we expected. And there's another uncomfortable part of loneliness. Sometimes we have contributed to it, we ourselves. Sometimes we have chosen temporary pleasure over lasting relationships. Sometimes we've neglected people. Sometimes we have assumed someone will always be there. Look back on your life. And sometimes we only reach out when we need something. Ooh, yes. Only then. And over years, relationships can be damaged. That matters too. I don't want to make loneliness into something that is always somebody else's fault. Sometimes there are people who loved us and we didn't tend the relationship. That's worth recognizing. It's not to punish ourselves, it's just to see clarity. Because once you start seeing clearly, gratitude becomes possible. And then competition becomes rather pointless. Nobody can take the space you stand in. Nobody. There's never been another person with your exact experience of being alive. So why spend your life trying to occupy somebody else's position? And why allow somebody else to tell you what your position should be? We lend our ears out far too easily. We assume other people know better what we need. And sometimes they know something we don't. So we must pay attention to that too. We must listen to wise people too. Yes, absolutely. But they don't have to live our life. They don't have to live your life. You do. When everything falls apart, the person who gave you the advice to do this and do that may not even be there anymore, but you still there. And this is something that rosemary has become very significant for me, something about rosemary. When I work with rosemary, there's a sentence that comes into my mind all the time. This is your life. I don't mean rosemary's literally talking to me. It's simply what the material has come to represent to me. Rosemary has this long association with remembrance, if you do your research. And somehow, for me, it became remember yourself. This is your life. Remember what matters. Remember where you're going. And I think you have to become quite calm to do that. Because being yourself doesn't mean changing around, doing whatever you feel like, being like a bull in a china shop. That's not authenticity. Sometimes that's just reaction, charging around. You need enough stillness to work out what's actually you and what is hurt, what is fear, what is anger. What is somebody else's voice that's been living in your head for 20 years? And I also think about a dragonfly. It can move incredibly quickly and change direction instantly, but it doesn't look confused. There's precision. That's how I think about it. Not a bull in a china shop announcing, "This is who I am." No, this is who I am. Just knowing quietly, this is who I am. This matters to me. This doesn't. This is where I'm going. And maybe when you start allowing that person to exist, something else happens naturally. The people who resonated only with the mask may not understand you anymore. That can be quite uncomfortable, right? But for the first time, the people who might genuinely resonate with you have a chance to recognize you because you are finally there. You're visible. And maybe that's the strange magic hidden inside loneliness. Maybe loneliness sometimes appears because there is a mismatch. The life you're living, the person you're presenting, the relationships you've built, the person you actually are not quite in the same place. And loneliness makes you notice that difference. I think that is profound because loneliness is not simply saying, find somebody. It may be asking, where are you? And this is perhaps why working with fragrance every day has had such an impact on me personally. I've noticed that after difficult experiences of disappointment, I now seem to find my way back to myself much more easily and much quicker. But I want to be careful about how I say that. I'm not saying fragrance treats trauma. I'm not saying it heals psychological injury or replaces therapy, medical care, or professional support. No, I'm not. I'm not saying that. I'm just sharing my experience with you and insight. For me, fragrance seems to have shortened the distance back to myself because I have become present when I work. I have to smell. I have to notice. What is this doing? What happens when I add that? Why did that disappear? Why did this suddenly become more beautiful? What's missing? That's too loud. I need to ask myself those questions. What needs more room? Do we need more air? And these questions about fragrance somehow became questions about my life. What's too loud? What have I allowed to disappear? What needs room? What is actually mine? What am I trying to turn into something it isn't? What would happen if I allowed this to be what it is? That is what fragrance has given me. Questions. And those questions keep bringing me back, not to some perfect version of myself, just myself. And perhaps that is why I find it easier now to let certain things go. The work reminds me beauty is still there, contrast is still there, I am still here, my life is still important. This is your life, and perhaps that is what I want to say and leave with you today. Not instructions. I'm not going to tell a lonely person to go out and join a club or phone the people to become more sensitive, phone 5 people. Sometimes perhaps those things do help. But that isn't what the conversation is about. I'm asking something different. If you feel lonely, I wonder who is lonely. Is it you? Or is it the person underneath everything you learned you had to become? Is the real you perhaps sitting quietly somewhere behind the person you present to the world? And if so, maybe there's nothing wrong with you. Maybe you haven't even properly met the people who could recognize you yet because they haven't had the opportunity to see you. And perhaps you haven't had the opportunities to see you either. So maybe don't rush to fix loneliness. Just become curious about it. What is it showing you? What part of you has been edited out? What were you told was unacceptable? What did you learn to hide? And underneath all of that, who are you? I think Fragrance asked me that question, and I'm still answering it. This is the Ease Podcast in the House of Living Essence. Thank you for sitting with me. I know it's been a long one, but it's so profound. I wanted to share everything with you. Until next time, I want you to remember this one thing. This is your life. And differently, this is your life. How would you like to have it play out?